Good morning and welcome to the Daily Cyber Briefing for Thursday, the 19th of December. I'm Stephen Ridgway. Chrome has got critical vulnerabilities that are being currently patched. So Google has released a security update for the stable channel of Chrome, which brings the versions up to 131.0.6778.204/.205 for Windows, and for Mac and Linux, .204. So various vulnerabilities listed them. I'm not going to read out, but they are mostly vulnerabilities in V8. So as always, if you are using Chrome, check that Chrome is up to date, bearing in mind that in the top right hand corner there is quite often something that says restart Chrome in order to apply patches or whatever that is. Just make sure that you do click that at the earliest opportunity. If you aren't seeing that, then it is perfectly okay to nudge Chrome to see if there is an update. Otherwise, I would expect it to get pushed out over the next few days. There is malware that has been developed that is exploiting eBPFs on Linux. Getting a little bit techie, but BPFs are Berkeley packet filters, so they are a very common, in fact, a ubiquitous form of, well, it's used as a firewall, but effectively it gives the kernel the ability to get, the kernel and the network card are very close to each other with, packet blocking or capturing and all sorts of other bits and pieces going on around that. BPFs work particularly deep in the stack, and consequently, writing malware for BPFs, eBPFs is just extended BPF, places the malware deeper than a lot of endpoint protection suites. So watch out for this stuff. A good article in HackRead explaining what's going on, but there is a campaign at the moment that is using BPF based BPF based malware for things like C2 servers, because you're kind of able to hide in plain sight. There are some well-known malware families in this space. BoopKit, BPFDoor, and Symbiote are the three that I've heard of. There are undoubtedly others as well. So be aware that this stuff is going on. If you are running internet-facing servers on Linux, just be aware that these sorts of rootkits may, if installed, will be able to turn your device into things like part of a botnet or possibly a C2 server or whatever it may be. So think about ways in which you can mitigate that, and also think about perhaps something that a lot of people don't do, but is not as hard as it seems, and is generally a good idea. Capture the traffic around your servers and feed that into your security visibility tooling so that you can actually see what's going on. So CISA is urging US government and political officials to switch to end-to-end encrypted messaging apps like Signal, following on from the wave of telecoms breaches across dozens of countries, frankly, including 8 carriers in the US. I think there's a lot of sense in this. I'm a supporter of using appropriate technology for appropriate levels of privacy. So this is a good thing. Interestingly, this goes flies in the face of the direction that the UK government wants to take us with the online safety, or the online make it unsafe bill that becomes law in, I think, March next year. Where they would desperately like to break all your encryption and generally snoop on and muck about with everything that you do. However, in the meantime, I would agree with CISA's recommendations here. If you are concerned about privacy, don't trust your mobile provider's network to be secure. Also, information coming from the States is that it is looking like TP-Link routers may be banned from US government or federal organizations next year. This is off the back of concerns over small routers being used, kind of Soho type routers being used in botnets. It's also interesting that TP-Link, small TP-Link devices crop up across a lot of networks where you wouldn't necessarily have thought of them as being the right thing to most appropriate thing. They're cheap and they are technically, they're effective. They do their job. However, there are various sets of credentials that can be used in password spraying attacks against them, and there is a campaign at the moment, or various, I think, campaigns to use these small Soho type routers for parts of botnets. Tend to get used for low intensity scanning of things. So a particular router, once compromised, can then be used to password spray various accounts, but will only be active for a fairly short amount of time. And the concept is to hide, from the attacker's perspective, is to hide what you're doing by spreading it thinly across a very large number of devices. So anyway, it is possible that TP-Link routers will be banned from next year. Now, bear that in mind if you happen to be running TP-Link kit. If the US government considers them to be too difficult to secure, it may be time to think about whether they are the right thing for you or not. I've talked about API attacks over the. Well, in fact, actually, I think I first began to be concerned about APIs as a significant part of the threat landscape probably about 5-6 years ago. And I've been saying for a long time, watch out, attacks on APIs will be coming. Attacks on APIs are going to be the next big thing. Well, guess what? They've actually finally got there. So article in Dark Reading talks about the fact that in India, okay, so not necessarily hit the UK yet, or Europe or whatever, but in India there's been a surge in API attacks, especially aimed at banking and utilities. API related incidents have jumped by 30 times compared to traditional web assets, which kind of indicates that our adversaries who've cottoned on to the fact that securing APIs, it requires a different skill set to securing more traditional web facing web apps or web solutions, and that a lot of organizations have not caught up yet with their abilities to monitor and protect traffic to and from APIs. So You heard it here. Well, no, you've heard it from all sorts of places. APIs do require some thought from a security perspective. Don't assume that because you can't directly browse to it that attackers are not aware of it or not throwing stuff at it to see what sticks. This bringing this to your attention, partly it's a good article. It does kind of illustrate the issues that I think we are all going to be increasingly facing. So if I had to have a prediction for next year, it will be that we will see more API-based attacks. If you haven't begun to think about how to deal with that or mitigations against API-based attacks for your own environments, then I would suggest now is the time to do it. And then finally from me today, Microsoft you may be aware that Microsoft has been pushing passkey authentication. And unsurprisingly, given the way in which they're pushing it, they've had some quite reasonable uptake. Now, at one level, we could look at that and go, well, hey, that's a win. Microsoft just continually pester people to create passkeys. As part of a move to get away from passwords, which are, I think, increasingly difficult to manage in a secure manner, given the number of password leaks and so on and so forth. However, I don't think anybody is properly talking about the caveats to moving rapidly to passkeys. So this is something to think about. If you are in a position of determining how authentication is managed for your environment, or you're in an environment where changes in authentication architecture is being enforced on you by, say, Microsoft pushing passkeys. So really brief recap, but passkeys effectively are using PKI for authentication. So you have a private key on a device that you own, and you share your public key. Well, you can share it with anybody you like. It doesn't, anybody you want to authenticate. You can give them the public key. Now, using PKI algorithms, you can then securely determine whether the server can securely determine whether the person at the other end of the conversation actually has the private key or not by only knowing the public key. Some very clever stuff. It's like Diffie-Hellman, right? Things that you know and share and so on and so forth. However, using PKI for authentication is much more complicated than I think most people realize. It's mathematically a little complex, but architecturally at that level it seems quite straightforward. However, managing it has very specific complexities. First one being, if you are authenticating this way round, the server is checking that the device has got the private key. That moves the security for that particular authentication attempt onto the endpoint, which means that all the factors that you need in order to authenticate are held on the endpoint. So yes, your private key is encrypted, but it's generally decrypted when you log into the device. Or if you've managed to compromise the device, you can probably unlock the private key, because in some way or another it's almost definitely going to be. For a lot of these, certainly these major player type keys, they're aiming to be transparent. which means that anybody who has compromised your device then has access to anywhere that private key gives them access to, with no further layers of protection available. That, I think, is slightly nervous. If you take a password, for example, other than if you store the password on your endpoint, the password isn't by default available just because you compromised the device. Let's take it back to, well, if it's something that you carry around in your head, it's not written down or stored anywhere, then actually in that case a password is potentially more secure than a passkey, depending on how well you're protecting your endpoint. And the other thing to think about is, if somebody does get access to your endpoint and copies off your private key, they can spend as much time as they like working out how to decrypt it, because it's effectively offline at that point. Once decrypted, they can then use it against whatever it was supposed to be used for, and there's nothing you could do. You wouldn't even be aware of the fact that that had happened. And then finally, managing these keys is something I haven't seen anybody talking about so far. Key rotation periods, how often the public and private keys need to be rotated or should be being rotated. How do you cancel a pass key that has been compromised, given that its public key can be shared widely? You may cancel or delete it on your device, but if somebody's copied it off to somewhere else, you need to then make sure that every server that has got your old public key knows that certificate's been revoked. Well, certificate revocation is probably the weakest part of PKI as an architecture. Mainly because it isn't even compulsory. It's an optional piece. The server doesn't have no components in a PKI environment are required to check certificate revocation lists. They might do, they might not. They might look at things like expiry of certificates and pop up this appears to have expired type warning. However, if the certificate's still theoretically valid but needs to be cancelled, that's harder to do comprehensively than you would expect. So interesting that we're moving into a passkey world as a this is the solution to all your problems kind of thing. I think it's just moving problems around unless we manage to deal with some of these questions about how to protect the private keys. Your average user does not understand about how to protect private keys. There we are. That's my thoughts for the day. So hope you have a good Thursday.